Okay, so I fear this is going to be a long one. So starting with my previous schooling before coming to Grand Valley, from second grade to the end of my freshman year, I actually attended a charter school in Walker called West Michigan Academy of Environmental Science, which was not as fancy as it sounds. I can't remember what college it was partnered with. I have the feeling it was Cornerstone, maybe? But anyway, we participated in standardized testing, but we largely made our own curriculum, especially when it came to the sciences. My first grade year, I did have a very brief stint at a rural public school. I don't really remember anything. And then from sophomore to senior year, so my last 3 years of high school, I was at Jenison High School, which is a suburban public school, not very far from Grand Valley. My education prepared me for higher ed by teaching me how to perform under pressure and meet deadlines. So not a lot of the actual material that was taught to me really stuck in my head or is readily accessible to me now, or was even really extremely relevant. But that ability to get my work done, pay attention in class, in like a classroom setting, take good notes, those were definitely cultivated. Not really taught explicitly by teachers, but kind of just had to pick them up to be successful in the public school system and graduate. Thinking of what I wish I learned more about, I would say the first one is probably practical life skills. I hear this from a lot of my peers. We really wish we'd been taught things like information about finances, taxes, life planning, job hunting, resume building. I know a lot of these are taught here and there in different like econ classes and things that people had, but it was definitely not a dedicated effort and it was definitely not a comprehensive effort. So that would have been great to know even at a basic level. Probably not until my last 2 years of high school. I wouldn't have freshmen learn that, but would have been nice maybe my senior year. My high school did have a class where you learned about sex ed and then some basic financial info, but you could opt out of it if you took APs so that you freed up more room in your schedule, and that seemed like a better option, a more cost-efficient option at the time. The second thing I would like to learn would have been how to make space for burnout and exhaustion. High school years are constant motion, trying to fit in as much college prep as you can, doing extracurriculars. And even if you aren't as focused on specific academic things or specific extracurricular things, you are trying to learn how to become a person. And I feel actually teaching people how to function at that level sustainably would have been great heading into higher education. Another area I would have liked to learn about would have been history in general. We kind of talked about this last week, but I feel schools don't teach history in as accurate of a way as they should. So even operating with the curriculum limits, curriculum requirements and limited time that they do, I feel teachers should do a better job of teaching the correct history. And I know that that's a very subjective thing to say, but I don't really feel history is very subjective. Anyway, if given an opportunity to advocate for change in my particular district, I would have focused on 3 areas. The first would be student mental health, which I already kind of touched on, teaching students about the mental health struggles that are common to their age group, and then just being more aware and receptive to mental health needs as a school. We had 1 counselor for a graduating class of almost 400, so there were 1,200 kids in the building, roughly, probably more, and we had 1 counselor. So that's not being very receptive as a school district to mental health needs. I also wish that sexual education had been covered better. I remember nothing from my sex ed class, I think just because none of it stood out. It was definitely an abstinence-based class. I think they probably handed out condoms, but that was about it. That was about as comprehensive as it got. I think that sexual education should cover a wider swath of sexual identities and promote the resources that Michigan and the local community has to offer, especially because it does not work to tell kids not to have sex. They will do it anyway. You are just promoting unsafe sex by promoting no sex. So I also wish that school, or another area that I would have looked for at my particular district would be diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that modeling a positive and no tolerance atmosphere for high schoolers is the bare minimum. Jenison High School has not been successful at that in the past, so you need to at least start at modeling that atmosphere and saying we are a no tolerance place in terms of bullying, and Jenison's had a lot of issues with that recently, and while I was there, gotta start somewhere. Moving more broadly to the biggest issues in the education system, the main one that I see is a lack of development of critical thinking skills. This is tied a lot to that first part of the video for this week that looked a lot at the Common Core. So students are not really being taught how to think critically except in very specific language arts and history-based AP classes. Those often require essay questions, and so students are taught how to see a block of material, think critically about it, and then write about it. But this is still a very limiting form of communication, and it's test dependent. Not a big fan of that. That's not how all students learn best. And it also follows a very strict grading rubric still, so it's not providing that room for individuality and expression. It is critical thinking, but it's critical thinking within a very specific set of standards and rules. So it's not as free form of critical thinking as I think schools should be promoting. I also see a very disappointing lack of funding for arts and sometimes just extracurriculars in general. So these are an area that almost function as a third space for high schoolers. Like, it is still that home versus school, 2 spaces, but it's almost a third space. You're not quite in school while you're doing those things, and it's where students can express themselves, learn the benefits of movement, and then just interact with learning in a different medium. Like, I don't think people realize how much sports is still an area where you are learning, and where the arts are still an area where you're learning. You're developing skills, you are learning how you best absorb information, and it's just a different medium than a traditional classroom setting. I think that's extremely beneficial. So funding for different extracurriculars like that is extremely important. And then that final issue that I have is with preparedness for adult life. So that's the things like sexual education, financial training, self-awareness, and mental health skills. A lot of these issues that I just talked about can be fixed with very dedicated earmarked funding. Like, this is going to the arts, not the football team. This is going to the football team, not buying new whatever. Like, this, like, having very specific earmarked funds. This is going to be for this. This is not general salary. This is for a counselor's salary, things like that. So that goes into my next thing, which would just be better pay for teachers and counselors in schools. I've read a lot of articles in past classes that talked about the extreme issue in finding people to be counselors at public schools, just because the pay is so low, the environment is kind of shit. You are being thrown into situations and issues, and it's an incredibly taxing and draining job, and then you're not getting paid on top of it. So dedicated pay to encourage the best kind of teachers and counselors to come into schools. And then also just changes to those requirements for a high school graduation. So instead of saying you need to prove on a standardized test that you can do these things, I'm not exactly sure how it would look, but I do think that the requirements for saying you've successfully completed a high school graduation should be different than they currently are. Looking at that very last question, I know this has been long. I believe that the role of government should be ensuring that teachers and staff are well trained, well paid, and are not monitored on the basis of their students' adherence to like that general benchmark, but rather a much more individualized review that looks at a student's progress over the entire course of their academic career. And then also looking more specifically at teachers' emotional and academic temperament. I think it's so hard when there's a teacher shortage, and it's very much, we need someone to fill this role. But teachers need to actually be encouraging creativity and critical thinking. The teacher themselves need to effectively teach material. I've definitely had so many teachers, I'm sure everyone has, who just should not have been teachers. Like, they did not teach material effectively. I walked out of that class feeling worse about my academic potential than when I walked in. So I think obviously that's hard to do, but a slightly more individual and both student focused, by focusing more on students' critical thinking and creativity, and then more teacher focused, focusing on, is this teacher an effective teacher? So that was my very, very long response for this week.